Hey everyone, this is Glenn Greenwald, and I'm back with a new episode of System Update here on our home on Rumble. And what I want to do is look in a fairly in-depth way at what I regard as a rather consequential and disturbing event, which is the ongoing FBI targeting of Project Veritas founder James O'Keefe, as well as other people associated with Project Veritas. And I want to look at this case in a somewhat in-depth way, both because I think it's important unto itself, but also because it is one of the most vivid windows yet into what I regard as an extremely authoritarian tactic that has become increasingly common as a means of attacking press freedoms by people who want to attack a free press while pretending they're not doing it, which is to claim that the people whose press freedom that they're attacking aren't really journalists. So they do this to Wikileaks, of course. When you object to the prosecution of Julian Assange as an attack on press freedom, they'll say, oh, he's not really a journalist. And when you object to or express concerns about the FBI's targeting of O'Keefe and Project Veritas, they'll say, oh, those aren't journalists. And they've actually done the same thing to me. In fact, in both of the most significant instances of reporting that I've done, I've seen that tactic firsthand. They do it repeatedly. They purport to or anoint to themselves the power to decree who is and isn't a journalist in order to then say the government is free to attack those people. And there's so much wrong, so many corrupt components to that tactic that I think it's really worth taking a look at, both in general and in terms of how it's being used in the O'Keefe case. So just to look through the basic facts of what's been happening with Project Veritas, here you see a New York Times article from November 6, the headline of which is FBI searches James O'Keefe's home and Ashley Biden diary theft inquiry. And the subheadline says, authorities carried out a court-ordered search at the New York apartment of the Project Veritas founder 2 days after searching the homes of his associates. So the FBI is sending people into the homes of O'Keefe and other Project Veritas associates, people who were involved in reporting numerous stories, obviously controversial people. Many stories turned out not to be true. Many stories proved to be true, just like is true for every media outlet. So they're obviously controversial. But what we know for certain in this case is that the FBI is going into their apartments, taking their cell phones, extracting information without explaining why they're doing it. And obviously, it's always a question, a serious question, a cause for concern when you have a Democratic administration in charge of the Justice Department and the FBI targeting conservatives who do reporting. And what's particularly bizarre about this particular case is that the argument that not the Justice Department, but its defenders are offering is that O'Keefe was involved in the theft of a diary kept by Joe Biden's adult daughter, Ashley Biden. And what's really amazing about that, aside from the fact that the Justice Department has not claimed that he's involved in that theft or that Project Veritas was, is the fact that Project Veritas never published that diary. They acknowledge they received a copy of it, but they decided as an organization not to publish it because they couldn't authenticate it. Now, obviously, being a journalist does not mean that you get to commit crimes. And if James O'Keefe or any Anderson Cooper or a reporter from the New York Times stole a diary from someone or stole property that doesn't belong to them, that's a crime no matter what. But there's no evidence in this case they did anything like that. But what's not a crime is for a journalist to receive information from a source that the source stole. And there's so many examples proving that, the most recent of which, and the most mainstream of which, is the fact that the Facebook whistleblower, Frances Haugen, has been widely celebrated by news organizations for stealing documents that belong not to her, but to Facebook that she took without authorization and distributed to news outlets that then reported on those. Nobody would suggest that those news outlets committed crimes by receiving information stolen by Frances Haugen, just like nobody would suggest that news outlets could be prosecuted for reporting on documents stolen by Chelsea Manning or Daniel Ellsberg or any of the people who stole Donald Trump's tax returns. That's always been a principle, that journalists can't be prosecuted simply because they receive and publish material stolen by someone else. But in this case, O'Keefe and Project Veritas didn't even publish this Ashley Biden diary precisely because they didn't have confidence in its authenticity. And yet the FBI is sending squads of people into their houses with search warrants to take their cell phones, extract information from it as part of an investigation that the FBI and DOJ has said very little about, even though numerous groups, including the ACLU, has raised serious concerns. Now, as I said, what I want to examine is not just what's happening in this case, but the main tactic used in cases like this by the liberal sector of the media, by Democrats, by, in general, authoritarians who want to target people who are engaged in the practice of reporting on public figures without admitting they're violating press freedoms. And that's to say, oh, these people aren't really journalists. And it was the New York Times, the same New York Times, that showed how that was done. They got from someone, we don't know if it was from the FBI search or someone else, copies of legal communications where Project Veritas, like journalists do all the time, asked their lawyers, we'd like to do this as part of our investigation. Is this legal? And the lawyers wrote memos back saying, this would be legal, but this isn't. The New York Times got their hands on that. Maybe the FBI leaked it to them. Maybe they got it some other way. And they reported on it. The communications between Project Veritas and their lawyers. Now, I seriously doubt, or at least question, whether the New York Times would have published the legal communications between, say, the Washington Post and its lawyers, or NBC News and its lawyers. But what the New York Times really did in this article was try to set up a framework to say, don't worry about what the DOJ is doing to James O'Keefe and Project Veritas. They're not really lawyers. Now, let's look at how the New York Times did that. It's an article from 5 days after they reported the FBI activity, from November 11th. And the title of it reads, Project Veritas and the Line Between Journalism and Political Spying. So they're already trying to put into your mind the fact that Project Veritas may be over the line where they're not actually journalists, but are political spies. And they, in that subheadline, describe how they got their hands on their documents showing how the group worked with their lawyers to gauge how far it could go before running afoul of federal laws, which, believe me, the New York Times does every day. They have their own lawyers, and they always ask their lawyers, we would like to do this in order to report, would this be legal or not? So it's really worth watching and looking at what the New York Times did here. So here's how the article begins, quote, hours after FBI agents searched the homes of two former Project Veritas operatives last week, James O'Keefe, the leader of the conservative group, took to YouTube to defend its work as, quote, the stuff of responsible, ethical journalism. And here's the New York Times' response, quote, Project Veritas has long occupied a gray area between investigative journalism and political spying, and internal documents obtained by the New York Times reveal the extent to which the group has worked with its lawyers to gauge how far its deceptive reporting practices can go before running afoul of federal laws. So they're already trying to make you think that having conversations with your lawyers about what the outer limits of the law permit is somehow unusual, when in fact that's what every news outlet, including the New York Times, does on a daily basis. The article goes on, quote, the documents, a series of memos written by the group's lawyer, detail ways for Project Veritas sting operations, which typically diverge from standard journalistic practice by employing people who mask their real identities or create fake ones to infiltrate target organizations to avoid breaking federal statutes, such as the law against lying to government officials. Now, again, they're trying to act as though communicating with your lawyers about what the law permits is suspicious, even though everyone does it. But note what they're really trying to do. They're setting up this argument that because Project Veritas engages in and uses undercover investigations, like the police do and like other entities do, where they pretend to be somebody other than who they are, they don't tell someone that they're a reporter in order to find out the truth, that somehow places them outside of the bounds of journalism, as though anybody who uses undercover investigations, this is what they're implying, is not really a journalist. The article goes on, quote, "The documents show, for example, Project Veritas's operatives' concern that an operation launched in 2018 to secretly record employees at the FBI Justice Department and other agencies in the hope of exposing bias against President Donald Trump might violate the Espionage Act, the law passed at the height of World War I that has been typically used to prosecute spies." Now, I can tell you as a journalist, I have often been worried about the broad scope of the Espionage Act and whether it can be used to prosecute the work that I've done. It's the statute that they used to threaten us in the Snowden reporting. It's the statute they're currently using to prosecute Julian Assange for reporting. You would be irrational if you were investigating the government and you weren't worried about the scope of the Espionage Act. I guarantee you, again, the New York Times frequently, because they're always publishing top secret documents, worries about exactly this question. They go on. Because intent is relevant and broadly defined, ensuring Veritas's journalistic intent is narrow and lawful would be paramount in any operation, the group's media lawyer Benjamin Barr wrote in response to questions from the group. So they're quoting Project Veritas's lawyers' advice to them, which typically is privileged and secret. The New York Times has decided, for some reason, that the public has a right to know what Project Veritas's lawyers have told them about what the limits of the law are. They go on, quote, "The documents give new insight into the workings of the group at a time when it faces potential legal peril in the diary investigation and has signaled that its defense will rely in part on casting itself as a journalistic organization protected by the First Amendment." Do you see? Every paragraph is designed to tell you that Project Veritas isn't really a journalistic organization. This is now the New York Times anointing to itself the power to say those people over there aren't real reporters the way we are. And if they're not really protected by the First Amendment. Now, that claim that you're not protected by the First Amendment unless you're a journalistic organization is itself completely false. But what's so dangerous here is the attempt, not by the government, but by the New York Times, to decide who is and who is not really a journalist. It's what's done every time there's a press freedom attack on WikiLeaks and on others. The New York Times goes on. One of the crimes listed on Mr. Keefe's search warrant was, quote, transporting material across state lines, his lawyers said. There is a criminal statute against taking stolen goods from one state to another. So notice, they're not accusing him of having stolen the material. They're saying he transported stolen goods across state lines. What about in the case of the Facebook whistleblower, which all of these media outlets are so proud of? Don't you think that when Frances Haugen took Facebook documents without authorization and distributed them like candy to multiple media outlets around the world, they transported them across state lines? Of course they did. They did the same with the Pentagon Papers, or with the material stolen by Chelsea Manning or Edward Snowden. But no one would suggest the New York Times committed crimes because they did that, as they're trying to suggest Project Veritas did here. That goes on to say, quote, Mr. O'Keefe likes to describe himself as a crusading journalist exposing wrongdoing, targeting liberal groups and Democratic politicians. He has boasted on social media that he is building, quote, the next great intelligence agency. Mr. Gruskin, who has written about Project Veritas, said that some of Mr. Barr's memos provided pretty good advice, particularly when it is permitted to recorded phone conversations and other tactical recommendations. He said that the undercover nature of Project Veritas's work was more problematic. So again, they're trying to say the thing that makes Project Veritas not journalists, they can't say it's that they get things wrong. This is, after all, is the newspaper, the New York Times, that did more than anyone to convince people that Saddam Hussein had biological, chemical, and nuclear weapons, which was a complete lie, or that led Russiagate fraud and publish one false story after the next. So they can't say Project Veritas isn't a journalistic organization because they get things wrong, since the New York Times does all the time. They're trying to say it's because they use undercover work. Quote, "It opens you up to the charge that you've been intentionally deceptive and you lose your moral standing," Mr. Gruskin said. "Every newsroom I've ever worked in has basically said undercover journalism was unacceptable. I've never had a reporter tell me he wanted to pose as somebody they were not." Okay. The New York Times, to tell you and others that Project Veritas is not a real journalistic organization, is saying that real journalists don't use undercover investigations. And that's because undercover investigations, by their very nature, entail lying. It means you don't walk up to somebody and say, "Hi, I'm a journalist." You pretend to be something else in order to find out the truth. And this, according to the New York Times, makes you not a journalist because now you're lying and journalists don't lie. Okay, that's the argument. Now, here's an article from just 2 years earlier, 2019, that had nothing to do with Project Veritas. That was about the use of undercover investigations by multiple news outlets that the New York Times applauded, and didn't at all say meant that these news organizations aren't really news organizations. It acknowledged there was a debate about whether media outlets should use investigative undercover reporting, but they never said it means, the way they're trying to say now, that it means you're not a journalist. The title was, the headline was "Deception for Investigative Journalism, Right or Wrong?" So they're acknowledging there's a debate within the media about whether news outlets should use investigative journalism. Here's one of the investigative undercover reports they praise. Quote, "In 2015, Al Jazeera's investigative unit had a question. What did the National Rifle Association say about mass closed shootings behind closed doors? To answer it, Al Jazeera planned a lengthy undercover investigation in which a reporter posed as an Australian gun lobbyist to infiltrate meetings with the NRA and with One Nation, a far-right anti-immigration party." Do you see? The reporter from Al Jazeera pretended to be something else, an Australian gun lobbyist, in order to infiltrate this group and do reporting on it. The result, released in a 2-part documentary that aired on the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, is at the very least compelling. So here you have the New York Times in 2019 praising Al Jazeera for using investigative undercover tactics to investigate the NRA that they're now trying to say no real journalist would actually do. In the article that I just got done showing you from last week, they go on, "In hidden camera footage shot during a trip to the United States last year, senior figures from One Nation are heard discussing the influence a donation from the American gun lobby could buy in Australia's parliament." That was what they learned, Al Jazeera, from this undercover investigation that the New York Times is applauding. The cameras also captured advice from the NRA on how to respond to mass shootings and sway public opinion toward gun ownership. So that is an example of an undercover investigation that the New York Times regards, in their words, as compelling journalism. They go on to praise other outlets that did the same. Quote, "There are, of course, many well-known accounts of undercover journalism, and like many people, I've read them with interest. From Gloria Steinem's infiltration of Playboy clubs to Shane Bauer's stint as an American prison guard." Gloria Steinem pretended to be a waitress at a Playboy club in order to report on what really goes inside. She lied. She didn't say she's a journalist. She said she was there to work. Shane Bauer pretended to be a prisoner, not a journalist, so that he could report on what goes inside in America's prisons. And that earned him, I believe, a National Magazine Award or some big, important journalism award for what the New York Times now is telling you no real journalist does because it involves lying. Quote, "It's one solution to a challenge all reporters think about. How do you get the information you need from those who don't want to share? I spoke to 2 professors about Al Jazeera's report and also asked the New York Times Standards editor, Phil Corbett, for his views. That being said," the New York Times editor added, "we recognize In other words, the New York Times is saying our standards are we don't like undercover investigations. But they recognize, quote, that other news organizations have sometimes taken different approaches. And there is a long history of undercover reporting that unearthed important information. Is it possible to express how dishonest the New York Times is? Just 2 years ago, they were heaping praise on news organizations for using undercover investigations. Al Jazeera, Mother Jones, Gloria Steinem, and others. But now that they want to convince you that you should be happy that the FBI is barging into the homes of Project Veritas journalists and other associates, they want to make a completely different argument, which is that Project Veritas isn't really a journalistic outlet because they use undercover investigations which no real journalist used. They just say whatever they need to say. They just make things up in order to advance their narrative, in order to justify the FBI's attacks on one of their fellow news outlets, even if it's right-wing, even if it's conservative. The New York Times is justifying the FBI barging into their homes based on a theory that just 2 years ago they rejected. Now, as I said, this is exactly what is being done to Julian Assange and has been done to Julian Assange for the last 10 years to justify his prosecution, his detention. Julian Assange and Wikileaks are probably the most important and consequential journalists of this generation. They've broken more stories than all of their critics combined. They've pioneered how journalism is done by allowing anonymous sources to pass information to them in large bulk that they then go and report on. So the question becomes, how can you justify having the U.S. government prosecute among the most consequential journalists of his generation? And the answer is to use the same tactic that liberals, that Democrats, that authoritarians use for Project Veritas. Oh, Assange isn't really a journalist. Here's an example. CNN, April 12th, 2019. Julian Assange is an activist, not a journalist, said someone named Frida Giedis, who's never broken a story in her life, let alone the mountain of huge stories that Julian Assange has broken. The Washington Post, May 28th, 2019. Assange is a spy, not a journalist. He deserves prison. AP, April 17th, 2019. Julian Assange is not a journalist. Now, there's so many bizarre things about this. Here is Senator Dianne Feinstein back in 2010 arguing, demanding that the Obama administration prosecute Assange under the Espionage Act. There is her op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, the Democratic senator from California and ranking member of the Senate Intelligence Committee. The headline is "Prosecute Assange under the Espionage Act." Just as the First Amendment is not a license to yell fire in a crowded theater, it is not a license to jeopardize national security. Here's her argument for why she thinks it's justified. Quote, Mr. Assange claims to be a journalist and would no doubt rely on the First Amendment to defend his actions. But he is no journalist. He is an agitator, intent on damaging our government, whose policies he happens to disagree with, regardless of Mr. Assange's claims to be a journalist, and would no doubt rely on the First Amendment to defend his actions. She says, but he's an agitator. Now, aside from the fact that WikiLeaks, again, has broken more major stories, revealing war crimes, forcing the top 5 officials of the DNC in 2016 to resign because of their systemic corruption, which WikiLeaks exposed, in 2011, they won the most prestigious journalism award in Australia. There you see the article from the Tribune announcing it. WikiLeaks wins Australian Journalism Award. The whistleblowing website published thousands of cables in which U.S. diplomats gave their views on world leaders. Here was the article about why they won. Quote, WikiLeaks has been recognized in Australia for its, quote, outstanding contribution to journalism, with founder Julian Assange lashing out at, quote, cowardly Prime Minister Julia Gillard in an acceptance speech. Quote, the anti-secrecy website was lauded at the annual Walkie Awards, where winners are chosen by an independent panel of journalists and photographers for its courageous reporting of secret U.S. cables. Quote, WikiLeaks applied new technology to penetrate the inner workings of government to reveal an avalanche of inconvenient truths in a global publishing coup, the Walkie trustees said in bestowing the award Sunday evening. So this tactic that they're using now, liberals and Democrats and the Biden Justice Department, to target Project Veritas. Oh, those aren't real journalists. That's the same one they used against Julian Assange. Even though Assange, like Project Veritas, whatever else you want to may say about him, has broken major stories. Now, one of the reasons that I'm so passionate about this authoritarian tactic of anointing to oneself the ability to say, he's a journalist, she's not a journalist, you can go after her, that's not real journalism, is because that was done to me repeatedly. In fact, in the two biggest stories that I've been involved with in my career. So in 2013, I was a journalist working at The Guardian, one of the oldest, largest, and most prestigious news outlets in the West. At least it was at the time. And I was approached by a source, Edward Snowden, who handed to me a gigantic archive of top secret documents showing that the U.S. government was spying illegally and unconstitutionally on American citizens, as several courts have come to conclude, and also showing that President Obama's top national security officials, led by James Clapper, committed the crime of lying to the Senate when he denied falsely, when asked, that the U.S. government was spying on millions of Americans. Pure whistleblowing. And what I did in revealing and reporting on that information was pure journalism. Now, a lot of people have forgotten what happened because that journalism went on to win the Pulitzer and the Polk. There was a film about the work that won an Oscar, Citizen4. There was a studio film that commemorated that film in which Snowden was played by Joseph Gordon-Levitt. I was played by Zachary Quinto. So it all seems like it was clear from the beginning that that was real journalism. But at the time, there was a concerted effort led by the New York Times and other establishment venues to argue that I should be arrested and that what I was doing in that reporting was not real journalism. The same tactic they're using now against Project Veritas and O'Keefe and that they've been using against Assange. The first article that I ever published in the NSA reporting was an article on January 6th in June 6, 2013 in The Guardian that revealed that the U.S. government was collecting all phone records of American citizens without any specific warrants. And the New York Times immediately went to do a profile on me to explain who is this Glenn Greenwald who has caused such disruption by revealing this incredibly consequential program. And the first article that the New York Times published to tell the country about who I was had this headline. They changed it because of the backlash, but you can still see it on Google. Anti-surveillance activist is at center of new leak. That's how they chose to describe me. Not as a journalist, but an anti-surveillance activist. Even though I was working as a journalist for The Guardian. I worked at The Guardian at the time. But the New York Times was so eager to help the Obama administration criminalize what I was doing that they applied this label to me that I wasn't a journalist, but an activist. It immediately caused a lot of backlash. And so now they immediately changed the headline. And you can still see this headline. This is the headline still up on the site. Blogger with focus on surveillance is at center of a debate. And you can see the URL right up here that they still have, that they never changed, that says anti-surveillance activist is at the center of a new leak. And the whole point of this New York Times article about my role in the Snowden reporting was exactly the same as what they tried to do to Assange and what they just did to James O'Keefe, which is to say, we're journalists. We at the New York Times, we're journalists. We have the right to First Amendment protections. But he's not a journalist. He's an activist, an agitator, a blogger at best. Look at what they said. After writing intensely, even obsessively, for years about government surveillance and the persecution of journalists, Glenn Greenwald has suddenly put himself directly at the intersection of those two issues, and perhaps in the crosshairs of federal prosecutors. So they're acknowledging that I may be prosecuted for the work I'm doing, and almost even encouraging it, saying I'm in the crosshairs of federal prosecutors because, in part, the New York Times had generated this narrative that I wasn't really a journalist. Late Wednesday, Mr. Greenwald, a lawyer and longtime blogger, published an article in the British newspaper The Guardian about the existence of a top-secret court order allowing the National Security Agency to monitor millions of telephone logs. Given that I had just broken one of the biggest stories, certainly of the year, if not of the decade, for a newspaper, The Guardian, where I worked, how in any way was I not a journalist? What made me a blogger, but the New York Times journalist? The article, which included a link to the order, is expected to attract an investigation from the Justice Department, which has aggressively pursued leakers. So the New York Times knew when they published that article that I was at risk, at jeopardy of being prosecuted, and they went out of their way to exclude me from journalism and to call me first an activist and then a blogger, and made clear that I was in some gray area, like they just called James O'Keefe. Now, at the time, the New York Times had a public editor whose job was to criticize the New York Times when they did wrong. They eventually got rid of that public editor. They no longer have one. So no one at the New York Times now criticizes the Times. But back then they had one, and her name was Margaret Sullivan. And she wrote an article 2 weeks later criticizing the Times for essentially creating a narrative that would allow my prosecution by the Justice Department for the reporting that I was doing. The headline was, "Who's a journalist?" A question with many facets and one sure answer. You see there, the public editor's journal. And then she wrote, quote, "Then quite separately, there's a question of the amount of professional respect shown to those like Ms. O'Brien and the columnist Glenn Greenwald, who has broken major news stories about government surveillance for The Guardian in recent weeks. Is Mr. Greenwald a, quote, blogger?" As a Times headline referred to him recently. That headline was atop a profile that did not use the word journalist to describe the columnist for The Guardian United States, the New York based web associated with the British newspaper. At the time, I wrote on Twitter that I found the headline dismissive. She goes on, "There's nothing wrong with being a blogger, of course. I am one myself, but when the media establishment uses the term, it somehow seems to say, you're not quite one of us." And that might be just fine with Mr. Greenwald, who has written disparagingly of some media people whom he calls, quote, courtiers of power. He also noted rightly that these matters have taken on more significance in the current climate and could be crucial for Mr. Greenwald. Under fire, the Obama administration has recently said that it won't pursue journalists, but Frank Rich, writing about the NBC Meet the Press anchor David Gregory, smacked him around, as did many others, meaning David Gregory, for asking Mr. Greenwald why he shouldn't be charged with the crime for the extent he aided and abetted Mr. Snowden, the NSA leaker. In a New York Magazine piece, Mr. Rich wrote, quote, "Is David Gregory a journalist? As a thought experiment, name one piece of news he has broken, one beat he's covered with distinction, any memorable interview he's conducted that were not with John McCain, Lindsey Graham, Dick Durbin, or Chuck Schumer." And he derisively suggested that Mr. Gregory today begin to host his network's Today Show so that he can, quote, speak truth to power by grilling Paula Deen. The public editor goes on to argue, quote, "So who's a journalist? I could explore the legislative and legal questions, and that may be something worth returning to in this space. Decisions that have been made in interpreting New Jersey's strong shield law are of particular interest. But for now, I'll offer this admittedly partial definition. A real journalist is one who understands at a cellular level and doesn't shy away from the adversarial relationship between government and press, the very tension that Americans' founders had in mind with the First Amendment." That is what I think is just so notable, is that all these people calling themselves real journalists, like at the New York Times or David Gregory, don't do adversarial journalism with the government. The people they say aren't journalists James O'Keefe, Julian Assange, in my case, myself, we're the ones doing what the New York Times public editor suggested is the very crux of journalism, which shows that when they say this, that person's not a journalist, what they really mean is they're not one of us. She goes on, those who fully meet that description deserve to be respected and protected, not marginalized. Now, I don't think it can be overemphasized how much in the air it was at the time that we started the Snowden reporting, that not just our source, Edward Snowden, but perhaps us, me in particular, and my colleague Laura Poitras, ought to be prosecuted on the grounds that we weren't real journalists. That's what the New York Times was doing there. That's why David Gregory, who never had an original thought in his life and only repeats what he hears in Washington, asked me when I want to meet the press, and I'll show it to you in a minute, whether I should be arrested, because that was in the air. They were talking about that at the time in Washington. And there was recently a report in Yahoo News that revealed that the CIA had been plotting to either kidnap Julian Assange or assassinate Julian Assange. And that was the bulk of the story, which I've covered. But along the way, this news report also revealed what the CIA was plotting against me and my colleague Laura Poitras at the time in the Snowden reporting. Namely, that they were going to try and say that we could be spied on or prosecuted because we were not real journalists. We were something other than real journalists. Here's the headline for the Yahoo News article, September 26, so just a month ago or so. Quote, kidnapping, assassination, and a London shootout inside the CIA's secret war plans against WikiLeaks. And here's the part that talked about what the CIA planned to do against both WikiLeaks and myself in order to justify reading us out of journalism so they could prosecute us. Quote, still chafing at the limits in place in 2013, top intelligence officials lobbied the White House to redefine WikiLeaks and some high-profile journalists as, quote, information brokers, which would have opened the use of more investigative tools against them, potentially paving the way for their prosecution. According to former officials, it was a step in the direction of showing a court, if we got that far, that we were dealing with agents of a foreign power, a former senior counterintelligence official said. Among the journalists, some U.S. officials wanted to designate as information brokers, as opposed to journalists, were Glenn Greenwald, then a columnist for The Guardian, and Laura Poitras, a documentary filmmaker, who had both been instrumental in publishing documents provided by Snowden. And then it quotes a former official as saying, is WikiLeaks a journalistic outlet? Are Laura Poitras and Glenn Greenwald truly journalists? We tried to change the definition of them, and I preached this to the White House and got rejected. Do you see how dangerous this theory is? When people start anointing to themselves the power to decree who is and who isn't a real journalist that's reporting on things and that's disseminating information. The whole point of that claimed power is to exclude people from the protections of the First Amendment free press clause in order to say, no, we can go after them. They're something other than journalists. They're agitators. They're information brokers. They're activists. All the things they're now doing to James O'Keefe and Julian Assange to prosecute them, they tried very hard to do to me for the reporting I did with Laura Poitras that ended up being celebrated, that won every award, but at the time, they were very eager to do that. Let me show you the Meet the Press clip when I went on Meet the Press at the height of the Snowden reporting, and here was the then host, David Gregory, on NBC News, and this is what he asked me.
NBC's David Gregory grilled journalist Glenn Greenwald during Meet the Press on Sunday when he asked why Greenwald shouldn't be charged with a crime for working with Snowden.
Final question for you, but I'd like you to hang around. I just want to get Pete Williams in here as well. To the extent that you have aided and abetted Snowden, even in his current movements, why shouldn't you, Mr. Greenwald, be charged with a crime?
I think it's pretty extraordinary that anybody who would call themselves a journalist would publicly muse about whether or not other journalists should be charged with felonies. The assumption in your question, David, is completely without evidence, the idea that I've aided and abetted him in any way. The scandal that arose in Washington before our stories began was about the fact that the Obama administration is trying to criminalize investigative journalism by going through the emails and phone records of AP reporters, accusing a Fox News journalist of the theory that you just embraced, being a co-conspirator with felonies for working with sources. If you want to embrace that theory, it means that every investigative journalist in the United States who works with their sources, who receives classified information, is a criminal. And it's precisely those theories and precisely that climate that has become so menacing in the United States. It's why the New Yorker's Jane Mayer said investigative reporting has come to a standstill, her word, as a result of the theories that you just referenced.
I think that was what was in the air in 2013. And it wasn't just David Gregory. Andrew Ross Sorkin, who at the time and still is a important business columnist with the New York Times and the host of CNBC, went on CNBC and said that I ought to be arrested, along with my source, Edward Snowden. He, the next day, went after a huge backlash and apologized on the air, claiming his words were hyperbole. He didn't mean to say that, but he did. And that was very much in the air, that we ought to be arrested and prosecuted because we weren't real journalists. Now, as many of you know, in 2019, I spent most of 2019 doing an investigative expose in Brazil that showed that there was high-level corruption on the part of Brazilian prosecutors. And I ended up being criminally charged at the beginning of 2020 based on that same exact theory, that I was not acting as a journalist, but was acting as a conspirator with my sources. There you see the New York Times article reporting on my indictment in January of 2020. It says Glenn Greenwald charged with cyber crimes in Brazil. And it says Mr. Greenwald is accused of being part of a, quote, criminal investigation that hacked into the cell phone of prosecutors and public officials. The article says federal prosecutors in Brazil on Tuesday charged the American journalist Glenn Greenwald with cyber crimes for his role in bringing to light cell phone messages that have embarrassed prosecutors and tarnished the image of an anti-corruption task force. The charges against Mr. Greenwald raised concerns among journalists and advocates for a free press because journalists often rely on confidential or leaked information, sometimes obtained by whistleblowers or hackers. Now, 3 weeks after that, the judge in that case dismissed the indictment against me and cited the fact that the Brazilian Supreme Court had said that because I was acting as a journalist, even if I had received stolen information from my source, I could not be prosecuted for reporting it because it's what journalists do. But that is always the attempt that is done for any power centers or governments or ideological factions that want to prosecute journalists, is they try and define you outside of journalism. It's what they did to me in Brazil and in the NSA reporting, what they did to Julian Assange, what they're now doing to James O'Keefe. Now, the attempt to say who is and isn't a journalist, as I have been explaining, is an inherently corrupt one. Who gets to decide that? What is the metric for whether you're a journalist or not? Why is David Gregory or Chris Hayes or Anderson Cooper, who never broke any stories in their lives, why are those journalists entitled to First Amendment protections, but Julian Assange, who broke more stories than they could ever dream of in 1,000 lifetimes, or James O'Keefe or myself, is not? It's an impossible distinction to try and draw. You can say, well, I think James O'Keefe lies. But obviously, the same people who say that believe the New York Times lies, believe that CNN lies, believes that NBC News lies, believes that Fox News lies. Are they going to define all of them out of journalism too? So it can't mean that. So the only argument that they have is, well, in James O'Keefe's case, he does undercover investigations. But how did that apply to myself or to Julian Assange? It's a completely artificial distinction. But here's the more important point. It doesn't matter who is a journalist and who isn't when it comes to First Amendment protections. The First Amendment free speech clause, the First Amendment freedom of religion clause, the First Amendment guarantee of assembly or grievances to your government for redress don't just apply to a small segment of citizens, but apply to all citizens. And the same is true of freedom of the press. The freedom of the press clause protects not a tiny, cloistered, credentialed, privileged, professionalized group of people called journalists, so that if you're somehow outside of that group, you don't get to claim the benefit of free press. The free press clause of the First Amendment protects an activity, just like free speech does. Free speech says all citizens have the right to engage in political speech without being punished for it. The free press clause says all citizens, not just journalists, all citizens have the right to use the press to do journalism without being punished for it. And this has been a debate that has been around for a long time, and it has been very decisively settled by people who pay attention to these things. And I just want to walk you through that argument that you should never allow people to convince you that the First Amendment free press clause is available only to journalists. So therefore, if you can prove someone's not a journalist, it doesn't belong to them, because it's a complete distortion of the First Amendment. So let's look at what the former Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, Warren Burger, said in a Supreme Court decision in 1978 where he addressed exactly this question. Is the free press guarantee of the First Amendment available only to media corporations and employees of them, or is it available to all citizens? Here's what he said, quote, I perceive two fundamental difficulties with a narrow reading of the press clause. First, although certainty on this point is not possible, the history of the clause does not suggest that the authors contemplated a, quote, special or, quote, institutional privilege. Most pre-First Amendment commentators who employed the term freedom of speech with great frequency used it synonymously with freedom of the press. Those interpreting the press clause as extending protection only to or creating a special role for the institutional press must either A, assert such an intention on the part of the framers for which no supporting evidence is available, or B, argue that the events after 1791 somehow operated to constitutionalize this interpretation, or C, candidly acknowledge the absence of historical support suggests that the intent of the framers is not important today. The second fundamental difficulty with interpreting the press clause as conferring special status on a limited group is one of definition. The very task of including some entities within the, quote, institutional press while excluding others, whether undertaken by legislative, court, or administrative agency, is reminiscent of the abhorred licensing system of Tudor and Stuart England, a system the First Amendment was intended to ban from this country. Those interpreting the press clause as extending protection only to or creating a special role for the institutional press must assert these fallacies. In short, the First Amendment does not, quote, belong to any definable category of persons or entities. It belongs to all who exercise its freedom. Think about what he's saying. In monarchical England, in the England of the king, that the founders of the United States waged a war to liberate themselves from, you had to be licensed, credentialed by the state in order to do reporting. But once they got to the colonies and began agitating against the king, the press didn't mean having a license from the king or the state. It meant using the printing press, like Thomas Paine did and the founders did, to express themselves. And the Constitution was intended to protect that activity used by any citizen. Now, there was an essay by David Stentel, the Court of Appeals judge, in the Cato Institute report of September 2014, where he examined the history of this debate, whether the freedom of the press clause and rights of it is available only to institutional press or to all citizens. And what he wrote is the following, quote, Justice Joseph Story, in his famed commentaries on the Constitution, described the First Amendment as providing that, quote, every man, not journalists at the New York Times, but every man shall have a right to speak, write, and print his opinions upon any subject whatsoever, without any prior restraint, so always that he does not injure any other person. The original meaning of, quote, the press, then, was not limited to an institution called the press. For instance, One of the most successful uses of a printing press in America at the founding, and indeed of all of our history, was Thomas Paine's pamphlet, Common Sense. Paine paid a printer to print the pamphlet anonymously and then donated all proceeds and his copyright to the United States for the cause of independence. At the time, Paine was certainly not a member of any institutional press. He was by trade an excise officer and later a bridge designer. Yet his 1809 biographer wrote that Common Sense was entirely, quote, unexampled in the history of the press. Thomas Paine, despite not being a member of the institutional press, despite not working for the New York Times or NBC News of the day, was exercising his freedom of the press, even though he was no professional newsman. The same is conspicuously true of James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Day, who published the Federalist Papers anonymously in various newspapers. This is decisive on this question. Don't let them drag you into the debate about who is a real journalist and who isn't. I'm happy to have that debate with people. When these drones at digital liberal outlets or NBC News or CNN want to say that I'm not a real journalist and they are, I'm more than happy to compare. I say, let's compare the stories I've broken and the significance of them to yours, which are zero. Or when I argue on behalf of Julian Assange, I say the same thing. Julian Assange has broken more major stories than all of you dweebs combined that want to say that he's not a journalist. So I'm happy to engage that debate. But that debate actually doesn't matter because it presupposes that the First Amendment is only available to people who are credentialed and licensed as journalists when the history of the United States makes clear it was available to all citizens. And to know that, all you have to do is ask yourself, which body do you trust to decree who isn't really a journalist? The FBI? The New York Times? Who gets to decide that enormous power? Now, the case of the FBI targeting Project Veritas is so extreme that even the ACLU, which does still occasionally defend the civil liberties of conservative individuals and groups, but only in very rare cases and does so very quietly, decided to weigh in on the FBI's targeting of Project Veritas. That's how extreme it was. They haven't, at least until this moment, published it on their social media accounts, which is where most people who donate to the ACLU, the liberals who donate to the ACLU, learn about their work. They just quietly slip this statement onto their website, probably so that in the future, if someone accuses them of being partisan as they are, they can point to this and say, oh, look, we kind of piped up in defense of Project Veritas. But at least they said something. They had to. It's such an extreme attack on press freedom. Here's what the site reads, quote, ACLU comment on FBI raid of Project Veritas founder. It's from yesterday, November 14th. It says, Project Veritas has engaged in disgraceful deceptions, and reasonable observers might not consider their activities to be journalism at all. So the ACLU is fortifying the authoritarian tactic used by the Justice Department and other authoritarian outlets like the FBI to give credence to the idea that you can determine who isn't a journalist. And they're saying maybe they're not even within journalism at all. Why would the ACLU do that? It's because they're about to go on and kind of defend Project Veritas, and they want to signal to their liberal donors that they hate Project Veritas and you shouldn't be angry at them for doing that. They say, nevertheless, the precedent set in this case could have serious consequences for press freedom. Now, they go on to say that if, of course, James O'Keefe was involved in the stealing of a diary, he's a criminal like anybody else who steals something. That goes without saying. If the New York Times stole something, they'd be a criminal too. That's not even an issue. But what they're saying is, given how serious it is when the FBI barges into the home of people who do reporting and who disseminate information, especially when the people who are targeted have the opposite ideology of the government in charge of the executive branch, it can have serious consequences for press freedom. So I am very disturbed by the FBI's targeting of James O'Keefe and Project Veritas. I recognize that it may turn out that they actually committed crimes. We can't know that. But when the FBI targets people who are clearly involved in doing reporting and disseminating information, we need to be very wary of that and to raise our antennas and to be cautious about it. But what I really wanted to underscore is how corrupting is this inquiry, how manipulative and deceitful it is to try and decree who is and isn't a journalist. In order to claim that Project Veritas isn't, as I showed you, the New York Times had to take a position that was the exact opposite of what they did in 2019 to praise Mother Jones, Gloria Steinem, and Al Jazeera. But the much more important point that I hope you take away from this is that in the future, when you hear people doing this, saying, oh, they're not a real journalist, it doesn't matter. The First Amendment, like all rights guaranteed in the Constitution, is not confined to a tiny little group of privileged, licensed, credentialed people. It is our right, our universal right as American citizens, given to all on an equal measure, no matter what the New York Times or the FBI decides to call us.